Hi, my name is Jan Vermeulen, and I have the pleasure of presenting the session on media and the right to know. By way of introduction, I am the editor of mybroadband.co.za. We are the largest technology news publisher in South Africa, and I've done my fair share of investigative journalism. Just as an example, together with an investigating partner out of the United States, we reported on the large-scale theft of IP address space out of the African continent. And last year, a lot of my time was dominated by Mirror Trading International. It was a cryptocurrency scheme that turned out to be a scam that was ultimately declared the biggest cryptocurrency scam of 2020 by Chainalysis. There have been other also cryptocurrency type reports. AfriCrypt is another investigation I've been involved in, and various other things like fake online stores and such, any kind of scheme where they try to swindle people out of their hard-earned cash. If there's time at the end, I'd love to go through some of the examples of this to illustrate where access to information becomes a problem for media, and to enable people's right to know, where information that should really be in the public domain isn't, and that inhibits our ability to investigate things. But I am conscious of our time, and I'd like to maximize it, use it as efficiently as possible. So I'm going to jump right into it. So I think most people are aware of the expression of the media as the fourth estate, or the fourth pillar of a democracy. And here in South Africa, and as I said, I operate out of South Africa, and so a lot of my my presentation is going to be biased towards South Africa, but I think that there's going to be a lot of commonalities with other places in the world, and easy enough to adapt to other places in the world. But that said, we've had the situation in South Africa where our executive and legislative branches have been riddled with corruption. We've turned it state capture, where private interests effectively captured a lot of our elected officials, and they started representing private interests and their own interests, enriching themselves off taxpayer money. And if it wasn't for a relatively independent judiciary, and I say relatively, I mean majority independent judiciary. There's some debate about whether the corruption in the executive and legislative branches was starting to infect the judiciary because they were starting to replace judges. But the judiciary remained independent enough that they were able to support the free press in South Africa. And so together, the judiciary and the press were able to hold the executive and legislative branches of the government to account. And so if it wasn't for these checks and balances in a democracy, then I actually would not even like to think about what might have happened in South Africa. And we're not out of the woods yet, but if it wasn't for these checks and balances, things could have been really, really bad. Then we have this investigative program in South Africa called Carte Blanche, and I don't want to disparage them. I've done work for them. They do incredible work, and they have this slogan, "You have the right to see it all." And I just want to illustrate that that things aren't as simple as a slogan is really the only point I want to make here. The slogan, I think, conveys Carte Blanche's message through well, and so once again, I don't want to disparage it. I think it's a fine slogan, but the complexity of the situation, as Carte Blanche themselves know, is that the right to know is not absolute. And there's going to be legal rules that prevent journalists from reporting certain things that make perfect sense, right? So reporting the identities of people who have just died before the next of kin have been informed, I think that sounds like a fairly sensible rule. There's going to be instances where the press can't report on the identities of journalists, where on the identities of witnesses, where those witnesses might be in danger if the identities are exposed. Reporting in some cases the identities of victims might not be allowed, or the identities of minors, especially where those minors are victims of crimes. And then reporting the identities of suspects themselves. because that might actually compromise a court case or an investigation. If, for example, a identity parade or a lineup hasn't yet been conducted and the press start reporting on the identities of suspects, a good lawyer might be able to argue in front of a judge that the whole process has been compromised because the identities of the suspects had been revealed in the press. Then there might be less legal rules and more societal rules, usually around the identity, around the publishing of graphic images. So sometimes there are actually hard rules about this or regulations against this, such as publishing dead bodies or even nudity. Now, in jurisdictions like the United Kingdom or the United States, tabloids might not have too many scruples about publishing nudity, but at least in South Africa, that's generally a no-no. There, I think, would be context in certain cases that might allow for that, but for the most part, it's just not allowed. And then there's times where things can get debatable and grey, such as the right to be forgotten in the EU, which we don't have time to get into right now. But the right to be forgotten has a direct bearing on right to know. And then national security. And, just a couple of quick examples of where national security had to be weighed up against the right to know, against the public interest, is with WikiLeaks and the publication of their cables and CIA spying capabilities, which people in the security cluster would argue weakened national security in the United States. But that has to be weighed up against the public good, right? Edward Snowden made that exact same judgment call when he exposed the NSA's capabilities, but because he believed that the public good outweighed that cost to national security, that he just strongly believed, and the people who agree with him strongly believed that people needed to know about the fact that the NSA had this mass surveillance capability that it was deploying against its own citizens. And one example of national security, the interplay of national security and the public good or the right to know, is this issue of 0 days. So the NSA exploits vulnerabilities in Windows, for example, that they think nobody knows about. That's where the term 0 day comes from. It's that the company, in this case Microsoft, or security vendors have had 0 days to respond to the vulnerability, and so the NSA was using this vulnerability as a way to spy. And then when it became public by a hacking group out of Russia hacking a hacking group that was doing work for the NSA, they published this 0 day on the internet, and it enabled ransomware to proliferate in the form of WannaCry, NotPetya. And even worse is later it came to light that China, North Korea, and Russia had exactly the same 0 day at their disposal. So the NSA could have cut off the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Russians' capabilities here by simply reporting the 0 day to Microsoft, getting Microsoft to close the hole. And but instead they wanted the capability, thinking they were the only ones smart enough to be exploiting it, or not caring maybe that their enemies were exploiting it as well. But that seems unlikely. And so this is a case where the reporting, the right to know about a vulnerability in software, generally outweighs a country's, even a friendly country's, surveillance or intelligence capabilities. Then to just look a little bit at the obstacles or threats to our right to know. The first obvious one is censorship. And in South Africa, we recently had some success in by the way of SLAP, which is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. And elsewhere in the world, especially in the United States, there's been legislation passed to help protect people against something like this, a frivolous lawsuit that is designed to silence, right? So you sue someone for defamation because you know that just defending the case will cost them a significant sum of money. And so, you've got a justice system that is skewed towards people who have the time and the money. And so people who might not want to spend the time or who don't have the money to defend themselves rather than stay silent. So it has this chilling effect. And it's not censorship that's on the law books outright or the government censorship, but it is a form of censorship that can be employed by the rich and the powerful. And so this is something that happened in South Africa, and I think that journalists around the world have to be concerned about. But there's a balance to be had here, right? So firstly, journalists can have an immense amount of power. If you just write vicious and nasty things about people that are untrue, then and there's no repercussions for that, then that can be a massive problem as well. But on the other hand, there not being sufficient protections for journalists or defense for journalists, it can have a chilling effect on investigative journalism and on free speech. So it's a tricky balance to maintain. But in South Africa, until quite recently, the balance was skewed heavily in favor of the wealthy. And so it has been an issue. Then there's things like internet shutdowns. And I am conscious of my time, so I don't want to belabor the points. But the graph, I think, illustrates the point well. And perhaps just to highlight a issue out of Eswatini itself, but with one of our next door neighbors. But like in 2019, 25 out of the 55 countries in Africa implemented some kind of internet shutdown. It might not be an outright shutdown. It could be throttling internet into unusable speeds, cutting off certain applications, usually social media, things like WhatsApp and Telegram as well, and then only allowing specific government functions through. But here recently in Eswatini, there were anti-government protests against the royal family. And the mobile operators were put in the situation where they had to decide between switching off the network or potentially losing their license and not being able to provide internet services at all in future. And so all of a sudden, a private company is put in a position where they've got to make a moral decision. And obviously, they're also gonna make the decision, the financial decision, right? So they want to be able to continue operating in that country. But also, yes, they want to be able to provide ongoing data services. So now, what's the right decision to make in that circumstance? And so this is a form of actual government censorship that is a threat to the right to know and to press freedoms. Access to public records remains an issue. And just as an example out of one of my own investigations is we had to pull corporate records, the records of a company in Uganda, and where some countries will have those records publicly available on the internet. Uganda, we had to physically send someone to the registrar's offices to pull physical copies of those records, scan them in for us at a cost per page, I believe, and send those to us for our investigation. Similarly, here in South Africa, our court records aren't properly digitized. I have easier access to US court records than I do to South African ones. But that, once again, is a tricky balance because certain things in court records need to be redacted. Certain personal information cannot be exposed on the public internet, right? So before you start uploading court records to the internet, you have to make sure that you've got the correct processes in place. But not having public documents in an accessible format certainly impacts our right to know as the public and our ability to investigate as journalists. Surveillance threats and attacks on journalists remain an issue. So where government use their surveillance capabilities, and this happened in South Africa, so that it's happened in more advanced countries. Then we had, the murder of a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, and his wife getting spied on by the Pegasus spyware. For those who might not know or don't remember, Pegasus is a government targeted spyware. It's a spyware designed for governments that uh, is developed by a company called NSO Group out of Israel, and it recently emerged, have been used to spy on heads of state and the wife of Jamal Khashoggi. So yeah, there are these threats as well that have a potentially chilling effect on journalists, or on people doing investigations, because you don't know if you are effectively placing yourself in danger by just saying certain things on your phone. Then other things that can affect our right to know indirectly is the journalists themselves eroding trust by publishing incorrect information. And so this is this is in the context of it being done unknowingly. So usually a government actor spreads misinformation or disinformation to a journalist that has used them as a source before and trusts them, and for whatever reason that the government wants to spread this misinformation, and then years down the line the media company has to retract, that erodes trust in them, and so that indirectly impacts their ability to report and investigate in future. So it's an indirect thing, but I thought worth mentioning. And then money. That is a talk all on its own, so I'm not going to belabor that point. In closing, I wanted to leave you with a quote from one of my favorite games from the 90s, called Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. And it is, beware of he who would deny you access to information, for in his heart he dreams himself your master. Thank you very much. I'll be around a bit later. If you've got any questions, feel free to contact me, jan@mybroadband.co.za. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a great day further.